Hello and welcome back to our study of wisdom. Today we continue our overview of salvation history, moving into the period of the return to Zion and the Second Temple period, so that we can better understand how the later wisdom books emerged out of Israel's traditions. So last time we ended with the Babylonian exile, and we know that the Babylonians were soon after conquered by the Persians and the Medes under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great was a very benevolent leader who allowed the subjugated nations under him to return to the lands from where they had been deported. And so under this initiative of Cyrus the Great, we see the Jews who are allowed to return back to their land. Now, the exile has profoundly transformed the Jewish people, and we're going to see that how it has changed them in this so-called Second Temple period. So after 70 years, the Jews returned to Jerusalem and set out to rebuild the temple. And we can read about this story in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So there's actually three waves of returnees. The first one under Zerubbabel in 538 BC. That's when they begin to rebuild the altar and the temple foundation. This building is going to be interrupted for a number of years, but eventually they complete it in 516 BC. Notice that this is exactly 70 years after the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. So really the fulfillment of a prophecy here spoken of by Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesied that the Jews would be in exile for 70 years. And so 70 years after the destruction of the temple, it is indeed rebuilt. We see another couple of waves of returnees. In 458 BC, Ezra returns. We can read about that in the book of Ezra, chapters 7 and 8. And then in 445 BC, Nehemiah returns and he rebuilds the walls of the city of Jerusalem. We read about this in the beginning of the book of Nehemiah. Nevertheless, the kingdom of Israel is not restored. There is no king. The Jews remain under foreign occupation, under the Persians to begin with. So it's a time of great hope, but also of great disappointment and great disillusionment. That's going to very much influence the theology emerging out of those years. The Second Temple was quite humble compared to the First Temple of Solomon. It is completed, as we said, in 516 BC, but the Ark of the Covenant is lost. The Holy of Holies is empty. So there is this tangible sense that something is lacking that used to be there before the exile, not to mention the fact that the kingdom is also not restored and this problem of still remaining under foreign occupation. It's in this context that the book of Esther is written. Now, Esther refers to the Jews who are still in Persia under the king Ahasuerus, otherwise known as Xerxes I. And so the book of Esther is not exactly a wisdom book, but it certainly has wisdom themes in it. Some have questioned whether it is a historical narrative, historical fiction, or actual wisdom literature. Some of the themes in the book of Esther, it speaks of divine sovereignty and providence, the Jews as people of God, the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, which is very tense, and of course the institution of the Jewish feast of Purim at the end of the book. Some of the literary techniques, we have use of irony and satire, recurring motifs and pairs, and we know that the book has significant additions in the Septuagint, in the Greek version of the text. So this book of Esther is within the context of the return from exile. The setting is still in Persia, and I'm just going it very quickly to give you a bit of a setting for this book, even though we're not going to formally study it in this course. Here's our outline to the book of Esther, and you can see in yellow and italicized would be the Greek additions to the book of Esther. So a vision at the beginning of the book, the edicts of the king, the prayers of Mordecai, and leading up to the Feast of Purim. So I won't even get into the narrative, but it's, of course, a fascinating book that you really should read if you haven't already. So is Esther a wisdom book? Well, some scholars have said, well, yes, there are many wisdom themes in the book of Esther. In the Hebrew version of the book, the Masoretic text, that's what MT stands for, we have a focus on anthropocentric concerns. No great focus on the person of God himself, on the covenant or the cult, but more on human relationships between Jews and Gentiles. We have an orientation to practical issues here and now. We have a lack of specific concern with national motifs, such as the land or Jewish law. Some motifs reflect themes that are found in Proverbs, such as the question of drunkenness, of wisdom, on how to relate to authorities and kings. Esther is also found in the writings, which contains all the poetic and wisdom books that is in the Jewish canon. The Septuagint, the Greek editions, add some more wisdom motifs, such as the divine providence that is made explicit towards the Jews. So the Greek version adds many prayers so that what is implicit about God basically working in the sidelines to guide the narrative in the Hebrew version, this becomes explicit in the Greek version. We have a focus on Deuteronomistic theodicy, so more prayer, Torah observance, and personal piety, some apocalyptic elements, and also a greater emphasis on Jewish-Gentile antagonism. Role models for Jews living under foreign domination. So those are just some of the themes in the book of Esther, and in the Masoretic text, especially in the Hebrew version of the book, we find several wisdom motifs. If we talk about post-exilic Judaism, I mentioned just a moment ago that the exile profoundly transformed the faith of Israel. What happened then during the exile? Well, we know that Judaism that was so centered on the temple and on the sacrifices, when the temple was destroyed, Judaism had to somehow redefine itself. And so it had to find a new focus now oriented around the Torah. Of course, when the Jews returned to the land of Israel, they rebuilt the temple and reinstituted the sacrifices, but still this focus on the Torah remained into the New Testament period throughout all those centuries between the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the coming of Jesus. We also see the development of eschatology and apocalyptic literature. So at a time when you have great hopes for the restoration of Israel, but these hopes are dashed, are disappointed, well, many of the Jews started developing this theology, the end times, saying, well, we kind of hoped that God would restore us in our former glory with a great king like at the time of King Solomon. It didn't exactly happen, so maybe we better, keep our expectations low, and we do believe that God will redeem us, he will save us, he will reestablish his reign upon the earth, but maybe that's only going to happen at the end of time. And so there's more and more focus not on the immediate restoration, but on this future restoration. There's also an increased expectation of the Messiah, since we haven't really been able to bring ourselves back to our former glory. Maybe God will send this anointed one, this Savior, who will rid us of all our occupiers and foreign invaders and finally give us this peace, prosperity, and political strength. There's also an increasing focus on otherworldliness, since this happiness that we are all looking for seems so elusive now in this return from Babylonian, from Persia. Well, maybe happiness in this life is just out of reach and we better wait for a time after death. So we're going to see an increasing development of beliefs in the afterlife, something that was largely absent in the earlier parts of the Old Testament. All of this was pretty rare. There was not much of an eschatology. There was not so much of a messianic theology, and even less was there much otherworldliness in the earlier books of the Old Testament. Another institution that arose out of the exile is the synagogue. Once again, when you have no temple, you have to find ways to survive religiously, and so this is where you started to have gatherings of Jews in places not for sacrifice, but for study and for prayer. So how to preserve the Jewish religion? You had to interiorize your faith. And you also had to universalize it so that you were able to preserve your religion and your faith even in the absence of a temple and even when you as a good Jew are away from Jerusalem. So worship could take place anywhere. Interiorization and universalization of the faith of Israel happened during the exile. And so the synagogue arises to fill these needs. It's truly a house where Jews can gather together, pray, teach the Torah, study from the Torah, and also worship God, even away from the central sanctuary in Jerusalem. The book of Daniel has this prophecy of a goat that clashes against a ram, and this is a symbol of this battle of Gaugamela that took place in 331 BC. And in this battle, we see the coming of Alexander the Great coming from Greece and Macedonia, who fights against Darius III, the Persian king, and Alexander defeats this Darius III, and basically the Persian Empire collapses at this point, with the victory of the Macedonians against the Persian Empire. So this is the end of the Persian Empire and the beginning of the Hellenistic period in the ancient Near East. Alexander the Great now institutes this Greek rule over the entire civilized world. His reign was fairly short, but in just 2 or 3 years, he conquers the entire Persian Empire, and Judea becomes this province of Alexander's empire. As you can see on the map, a huge empire that extended almost on the way to Mongolia in the east, and taking over much of Egypt as well. After Alexander's death, we see the division of the Greek Empire into 4 regions governed by the 4 generals of Alexander. So the 2 that are really relevant for us in Israel and Judea are Ptolemy and Seleucus. So the Ptolemies were based in Egypt and the Seleucids were based in Syria. And we're going to see a tug of war between the Ptolemies and Seleucids for the next 1 or 2 centuries. Between 301 and 198, Judea is under the rule of the Ptolemies. It's a fairly peaceful and quiet rule. The Jews are able to live in peace, in relative prosperity. And so here's the empire of Alexander, and here it is after the death of Alexander. So the green would be the Seleucid Empire, and the red, based in Egypt, would be the Ptolemaic Empire. And as you can see, Judea, Israel, is under the Ptolemaic reign for basically all of the 200s BC. At this time, we see this term, the diaspora. So Jews start to emigrate looking for new economic opportunities. So they migrate to various colonies throughout the known world under the Ptolemies, including the great center of Alexandria. So Alexandria in Egypt will become this major Jewish center in the Mediterranean world, in addition to Jerusalem. So diaspora Jews learn the Greek language and they adopt also Greek customs and ideas. In fact, most Jews who migrate into the diaspora, after 1 or 2 generations, they start forgetting their Hebrew and they're barely able to read the Bible in Hebrew anymore. So this is going to give rise to another need, that to have a Greek Bible. So around 250 BC, the Hebrew scriptures are translated into Greek, and this is the creation of the Septuagint, otherwise known as the LXX for 70. There's a pious tradition that says that the king Ptolemy gave the Hebrew Bible to 70 scholars, asked them to translate the Bible into Greek, and the 70 scholars independently all came up with the exact same translation. So there's kind of a miraculous creation of the Septuagint, more than likely a pious legend more than historical fact. At this time, we see the rise of a lot of so-called Second Temple literature. We are now in the Second Temple period, from the time of the rebuilding of the Second Temple in 516 up to its destruction in 70 AD after Christ. So this is the time of the writing of the Apocrypha, otherwise known as deuterocanonical books, of which we have several wisdom books. Now, with the coming of the Seleucids to power, the Seleucids will wrestle Palestine or Judea from the Ptolemies, and things will change dramatically for the Jews. So King Antiochus III defeats the Ptolemies in 198 BC and conquers Judea. At first, things are okay under Antiochus III and his successor Seleucus IV, under a very good high priest by the name of Onias III. But then under his successor, things become very bad. So in 175 BC, we see a man called Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He inherits the throne, and he starts this massive, very aggressive campaign of Hellenization. We now see a very corrupt Jewish guy called Jason who seizes the high priesthood, and he begins this campaign of Hellenization. Another guy, Menelaus, supplants Jason, and we see this great rivalry for the high priesthood, the murder of the former high priest Onias, and this great chaos in Judea and Israel under Antiochus IV. So the struggle, the tug of war between those two corrupt high priests, Jason is killed, and we see then that Antiochus begins this massive persecution of the Jews in Jerusalem and in Judea. This begins in 169 BC, and Antiochus invades Egypt a few times, and in the process he massacres Judeans and plunders Jerusalem and the temple a second time in 168 BC. So this leads to a full-fledged persecution of Judaism. The Sabbath and circumcision are outlawed. Desecration of the temple, he persecutes faithful Jews. He even goes as far as sacrificing pigs on the altar in order to desecrate the temple. So here we read in the books of Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, about the martyrdom of many faithful Jews, including Eleazar and 7 brothers who are killed before their mother. So this will lead to the Maccabean revolt. Finally, the Jews have enough, and one priest, Mattathias, and his 5 sons launch this revolt, and so they are known as the Maccabees. Under Judas Maccabeus, they win many victories, and at some point Antiochus IV dies in 164 BC, and the Jews go on to raking up more victories under not just Judas, but his brothers. Eventually, they recapture Jerusalem, and they purify and rededicate the temple in Jerusalem. And the word for dedication in Hebrew is Chanukah, and this is the institution of the feast of Chanukah, this purifying and rededication of the temple after this persecution from the Greeks. The war continues against the successors of Antiochus IV, Antiochus V, and others. So it's a very convoluted, complex history. You can read about it in the books of Maccabees, which of course are part of the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books. In the midst of all these battles, the Jews make a very unwise choice, and they decide to find themselves some allies. Far west, they hear of this new rising empire that is called Rome. And so the Jews send envoys to Rome trying to get some help against the Greeks. And of course, this will lead to not good things when the Romans turn against the Jews later. Judas Maccabeus is killed, and he is followed by his brothers. So here is a bit of an outline of the 2 books of the Maccabees, if you're interested in reading these books that really give us the setting for the rise of the later wisdom books in Israel. So the various wars and the exploits of first Judas Maccabee, then Jonathan, then Simon Maccabee. And 2nd Maccabees has some overlap, but not entirely, with the first book of Maccabees. And for this, we have the Maccabee beer in Israel today that has remained from these Maccabean wars. So God writes with crooked lines. This chart gives you an idea of the complexity of this period, the Maccabean Wars, and we can see how 1st Maccabees covers this period, 2nd Maccabees covers more like the beginning of this period. So we can see the various Greek rulers and who fought against who, and we can see in blue the succession of the Maccabees. under the Maccabees, things go well for the Jews. So under Jonathan, Jonathan takes over the high priesthood, and under the leadership of Simon, Simon becomes ethnarch and high priest, and in 142, Simon actually wins political independence for Judea. So they kick out the Greeks, and for 80 years, we're going to see the Jews regain their independence. We have an independent kingdom of Judea, of Israel, that is back in the Holy Land after all these many years of foreign occupation. So it's an expansion of the kingdom, political consolidation, and also flourishing of Jewish life. So it looks like God is in the process of restoring his people again. So what do you think is going to happen to the wisdom literature of that time? Remember what we said under King Solomon. Solomon was in a position of strength, of peace, of prosperity. All the nations came and paid tribute to Solomon. So the wisdom literature of that time was very universal. It was not particularly Jewish, and it was really addressed to all those nations and Gentiles who came to join Israel in their worship of the God of Israel. Now, fast forward to this period. What do you think is going to happen in this period of severe conflict where the Jews are fighting against the Greeks? Now their attitude to the Gentiles is, we want to kill you. And so how is that going to be reflected in the wisdom literature of that time? Well, we're going to see a Judaization of this later wisdom literature. Now that the situation with the Gentiles is a lot more tense, it's a situation of war even, well, our authors of wisdom literature are really going to emphasize that Judaism is the way to go. We want to have nothing to do with those evil, pagan, godless Gentiles. And we see that reflected very much in the latter books of wisdom, such as Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon. The irony is that the Hasmoneans, who are the Hasmoneans, by the way? They're the dynasty that were established by the Maccabees. They're more or less a synonym for the Maccabees. So those later Hasmoneans, whereas the first Hasmoneans fought so hard to free the Jews from all this Hellenization and this campaign of the Greeks to assimilate the Jews into Hellenistic culture, later Hasmoneans become more and more Hellenized. And so the Hasmonean dynasty, very complex, also as you can see from this genealogical tree. This is what it looked like. Mattathias, who is the initiator of the Maccabee revolt, followed by his son Judas, and then his brother Jonathan and Simon, followed by John Hyrcanus. We're now in the 1st century BC. Aristobulus, Alexander Jannaeus, his mother Alexandra Salome, and around this time we see the rise of various sects. Because, if I backtrack just a minute, as I said, those Hasmoneans are becoming more and more compromised with Hellenism. They're basically watering down the purity of Judaism. So you're going to see Jewish sects arise at this time that are going to want to preserve the purity of Judaism in the face of this increasing Hellenization of the Hasmoneans. So those sects are very well known from the pages of the New Testament. 3 main religious factions emerge under Hasmonean rule. The first are the Pharisees. These are the spiritual fathers of modern Judaism. They believed in divine authority of the oral law, rewards and punishments in the afterlife, and in the coming of the Messiah. The Pharisees mean the pure ones, Purushim in Hebrew. We also have the Sadducees, who are from the priestly caste. They rejected the oral law and they rejected belief in the afterlife, and were a lot more willing to compromise with Hellenism, and later even to compromise and cooperate with the Romans. Then we have another separatist group, the Essenes. They believed all the other groups were corrupt, and so they completely moved out of Jerusalem and settled in their own community in the desert by the Dead Sea. So they adopted strict dietary laws and a commitment to celibacy. So they really said, Pharisees and especially the Sadducees are completely corrupt, so we're going to start our own community in the desert. What did Judaism look like after the exile? We now have the prophetic word of scriptures. The priests still officiate in the temple liturgy, and we have the rulers or the Pharisees now guiding Israel's religious life. Okay, here is again the continuation of the Hasmonean dynasty. What happens after Alexandra Salome? We have her two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, who basically go to civil war, one against each other. And both of them now appeal to the Romans to help them. The Romans come in, and the Romans say, well, we're going to take charge. So the Roman general Pompey conquers Jerusalem in 63, and now it's a whole new, different landscape. The Romans establish Hyrcanus II as the high priest and ethnarch, and this Hyrcanus has an advisor who is called Antipater the Idumean, and this Antipater will have a rather infamous son called Herod. And so we're going to see Antipater and Herod who are going to start to fight against the line of the Hasmoneans. Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus II, will be the last Hasmonean. He goes to war against Herod, and Herod will wipe out this last one of the Hasmoneans, bringing an end to the Hasmonean dynasty in 37 BC. So once again, we see the hopes of Israel very much dashed. The Maccabeans won this victory against the Greeks. They established an independent kingdom of Israel, but this leads to increasing Hellenization, corruption, factions, divisions, leading to civil war, and now the Romans stepping in, establishing Herod as a puppet king and bringing an end to this Hasmonean dynasty. And Herod will rule from 37 to 4 BC. And of course, this brings us to the edge of the New Testament with the rise of Rome. Pompey, as we said, conquers Jerusalem. In 47, Judea becomes directly subject to Rome. And in 37, the Romans appoint Herod to be king of Judea. The Roman Empire is founded in 27 BC by Augustus. And the Pax Romana will bring peace and ease of travel in the Roman world. So there is the Roman Empire, now the latest great power taking over the entire civilized world. Herod the Great, as we said, was appointed in 37 BC, a ruthless leader who not only brought an end to the Hasmonean dynasty, but also killed many of his own family. So a very ruthless, paranoid leader, one of the most powerful monarchs in the Eastern Roman Empire. But this is because he knew how to play his cards very well, and he knew how to win the favor of Rome and staying on Rome's good side. Herod had his good side and bad side. On the bad side, he killed half his family, but on the good side, he launched this massive construction program, most notably greatly expanding the temple. So the humble temple of Zerubbabel, the second temple, becomes greatly expanded by Herod and becomes one of the great wonders of the world. And this is an illustration of Herod's temple. So at this time, with the ruthless rule of Herod, we see the rise, or the increase rather, of great messianic expectations. And so as we come to the Common Era, the Jews are expecting and hoping more and more for the coming of the Messiah, this anointed one, an instrument by whom God's kingdom would be established in Israel and in the world. This Messiah would be a royal son of David who would bring victory and prosperity to the Jewish nation and set up his throne in Jerusalem. And as we know, Jesus will be this promised Messiah, the Messiah of Israel. Good. So this completes our overview of the Old Testament. It shows us the setting for the development of the later wisdom books. We didn't say very much about wisdom in this lesson, but it gave you basically the historical skeleton so you can better understand the context out of which the apocryphal or deuterocanonical books emerged in Israel, namely the books of Sirach, Tobit, and the Wisdom of Solomon. And we will study those books in separate lessons. Thanks for watching. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.